Okay.
All right. Okay. So in the first part, we talked about Irish prehistory. That was everything from the first arrival of Mesolithic Irish people right up to the Iron Age, which is quite a long discussion. This one will hopefully be a little bit shorter because we're only dealing with about 200 years of history. Now, this is the period where Ireland emerges into written history. That means emerging into indigenous written history, because the Irish people learned how to write Latin and to a lesser degree Greek within this period. Later on, they would also write down their own language in using the Latin alphabet. The origins of the language in Ireland, by the way, just to the written language, they begin slightly before this period. We're starting round about between 500 and 600 AD, and we're going to end roughly about 800 AD. The earliest written records from Ireland are written in an alphabet known as Ogham, which was it's a little bit like the runic type thing from Norse thing, in the sense that it's symbols rather than an actual alphabet, but it was written in you sometimes find it written on stones. This is basically how we've got any idea of it at all, and it's written in Old Irish actually, or ancient Irish, in fact, because this is the only record we have of pre-Christian Irish, and it's written on a vertical line, and then there you have cross lines which go either straight across or else they go at an angle up and down this vertical, what the form took. But by this time, the period that I'm talking about, from about 500 AD onwards, the Irish were already writing using the Latin alphabet, and for the most part, they were writing in Latin. It has to be said, but they did also write in Irish. Right, so we can move on to the first picture, I think. Oh, I'll just explain what that picture is. That's the one we had up just now. That is Skellig Michael, which you find on the southwest coast of Ireland today. It's quite a famous site. It was a hermitage used by early Irish monks, and those are the beehive huts in which they lived. And as you can see, very bleak, but spectacular scenery which it was set in. Okay, move on to the map, please. Yeah, so this is the political groupings that were emerging in Ireland at the start of the historical period. The country was divided into numerous small polities. That's 150 of these small polities, and each polity was known as the tua, which the plural is tuaha. So there were 150 to 180 of these, which were sort of like small clan or tribal groups, and each was ruled by a ri, or king. I put king in scare quotes because they went what we would understand as kings. He was known as the ri tuaha, or more accurately, I think, he'd be better described as a dynastic chieftain. The tuaha varied greatly in size and power, and each was confederated into ad hoc groupings of local tuaha under an accepted but often quite unstable and temporary leader of that group. And the leader of that group would be known as the Ruri, or over-king. The only larger polity than this was a similar arrangement to the over-kingship, that of the Ri Guga, or the provincial king. And he was connected. Well, everybody under him was connected, at least in theory. Well, not everybody, but a number of the over kings below him would be connected, at least in theory, to a common dynastic lineage that they all shared. As I say, at least in theory, because there's a lot of gray areas in early Irish political arrangements. No political office of a high kingship over all Ireland yet existed, and the Ineal, which you can see on the map there, there were two groups of the Ineal. There's a northern and a southern branch. They were the first to even start talking about the concept, and probably around they probably started talking about it between about 330 to 450 AD, following their defeat of two other groups known as the Uli, who were in the northeast at the dawn of the historical era, and the Leyen, who were in the southeast of the country. Now we'll start talking about the different groups here on the map. There was originally the highest level of king was known as the king of a fifth of the country. But that political arrangement had already disappeared by the dawn of the historical era. So as you can see, there are actually seven groups there, seven main political divisions, and the Uli, who are in the northeast in this era, they originally controlled the whole north of the country, and but they had been pushed back into the far east, and the other group known as the Aegila in the middle. Now the first mention we have of them historically is actually from the 9th century. So we don't know whether they existed even in this era, but we think they might have done. What we do know is that they were a sort of allied to the northern and southern Ineal. Now the northern and southern Ineal emerged from Clonard originally. They were the names of the groupings quite important as well. You'll see that there are these new names which are appearing. The Dáil, they either start with the word Dáil, or else they have a prefix of e, which means descendant of or share of. We know that other groups which are receding into obscurity are their names derive from either totemic figures like the Osere in the south, the Osere or the Muskre. They were their names actually mean the boar people or the deer people. So we think that they probably were originally more from an earlier period of history, and so the groups which don't have those prefixes, the Dáil or the e in front of them, are more likely to be which you might call aboriginal, for want of a better word. Now the Ineal had conquered the northern part of Leinster or the Leyen, and that's the southern Ineal had conquered them, and the northern Ineal had conquered the province of Ulster or the Uli. The Connachta were where they had come from, the Ineal. They were descendants of Con of the 100 Battles. That's why it's called the Connacht. And the Ineal were the descendants of Niall of the 9 Hostages, who was their founding figure. And these are dynastic groups, as I say. The Leyen, we don't really need to talk about very much at this point, but we will talk about Munster in the bottom. That's quite important, because the Munster was actually the wealthiest part of Ireland, and the reason for that was that they at this period, because they not only had some of the best land in the country, but they also we know that they were very closely connected with trade to former Roman Britain, and also they had also established with the withdrawal of the Romans, they also had established settlements in what is now Cornwall and Wales, and we call them Munster, but at that time, what it was that there were two groups that traditionally ruled Munster. They were the Osere in the east of the country, or the hegemonic bloc, and the Corca the Corca, who are in the southwest of the country. But by this time, those two had really they had shrunk in power, and the main groups were the Oanachta, and the Oanachta were a group of different dynasties, very closely related dynasties. The the Oanachta Cashel being the most important in the center of Munster. In the west, in northwest of Munster, however, there's another group which we'll come to in a later point, but they become much more important later on. They're the Dal Goish, and the Dal Goish eventually they were to sire Brian Boru, who's one of Ireland's most famous kings. Okay, so I'll now start to talk about the office of a king. It is important to establish the limitations on a king's power at any level. He had no legislative, coin minting, or tax raising power, restricting his role to diplomatic, ritual/ceremonial duties, and as a war leader. Those were his main duties, and he didn't have any powers really beyond that. His hold over his immediate subjects, whether they were lesser kings or minor aristocrats in his own kingdom, depended solely on his personal generosity in the spoils of war, conferring rewards, etc., and his ability to ally or join as many followers as possible to his dynastic line. You might think, oh, well, if you just give as much weight to people, then that makes you a lot more powerful, which of course lots of people did, but it also makes it a lot more likely, because of the descent system, that you're going to have a lot of different people squabbling over who succeeds you. There was no primogeniture descent rule, so succession was open to anyone out to a very wide seven grades of kinship. So you could be removed from the main line, from the person who just died, the chief who just died. You could be removed from him by up to 7 grades of kinship, which is known as the Gervina, and that applied across the entire dynastic lineage group, and it included the sons of commoners and the sons of even slaves, because we know of several Irish kings who very humble origins, as a place to start. Furthermore, your selection as a king, you are allowed to nominate a successor. The successor was known as the Taoiseach, but when you actually died, the successor was put to a majority election of the notables of the Tua, or if it was a higher level, the grouping of Tua, and therefore you were also subject to election, and you know, a lot of Taoiseachs who'd been selected by the former king would be overruled by the election at the end, and they would choose somebody else for whatever reason. Membership of the aristocracy, which is known as the flaith, was defined by property qualifications and the number of clients that you had. Now, clients are very important to power in early Ireland. This in turn was linked to your dynastic connections. Martial prowess was very important too, and the system of rewards, which I've already explained above. Although we do not have enough surviving information to prove it, it's quite likely that the same relationships of power over those of kings, because we have the most information about kings, and the obligation of generosity would be replicated all the way down the hierarchy to the very bottom of what we would consider to be free society. So that would be the vast majority of people living in Ireland would be free to some degree or another. And these ties of these patron-client relationships would be replicated all the way down. There was, in essence, nothing to prevent the commoner client of a mean or exacting aristocrat, for example, from deserting him and entering into a contract with another who is more generous, fair, and rewarding. In the absence of a centralized state, the keepers of this social organization had originally been the priestly, learned, or judicial class. These were known as the Aishtana, or the Druids is a more common term for it. As the Celtic, in square quotes, religion of the Druids fell out of favor or was converted into Christianity, then the practice of the same class continued to be upheld by their immediate successors, now divided into Christian clerics and their separate, though affiliated, secular schools of lawyers, bards, healers, and poets. The latter memorized a rhythmic oral transmission of traditions, laws, and judgments, whereas the former were the direct successors, if you like, of the priestly aspects of the Druids, but they were now Christian monks for the most part, some bishops, but mostly monks, and they had an aura. They had inherited as well the Druidic aura of magical power, and they were also largely responsible for the shift to writing in the Latin alphabet. Because together they formed a class that was not bound by the restrictions of tour affiliation, which all other members of society were, or martial rivalry, because they weren't generally involved in combat either. There was no restriction on either their movement or on their coherence ideologically. I think this is quite important. So therefore, an extended struggle, as experienced in many post-Roman Germanic run societies, for example, between Christianity and paganism, that would have been counterproductive. It would have been if any extended struggle like what happened in the Germanic run societies would have been counterproductive to their power as a class. It should also be pointed out that at least as much as for kings, entry to the learned elite was strictly defined by ties of descent, not those of wealth. Now, this is another speculation, but it's because we talked about this when I was talking about the Neolithic, that the Neolithic society was not politically connected at all. There were no hierarchies of a political nature in early Ireland, as far as we are aware. But there was some sort of religious unity, and we know that was the case. So it's possible that, and we know that they were very closely related the Neolithic era priests were very closely related on a kinship level. So it is possible that the one can use this as an argument to say that the Druids were the descendants of the people who who built the major megalithic structures in Ireland. That is a theory. It's not necessarily fact. It's just a theory. But when Ireland adopted Christianity, Christianity became very popular amongst all classes, as I will explain later, and the ties of descent, although still important, were often superseded by other more egalitarian strains. The commoners would have been by far the largest social group, even during times of intensified slave accumulation through warfare and trading. Like nobles, with whom they existed in a patron-client relationship, commoners were defined by property, which by the early medieval period was beginning to become legally quite important, especially as membership of the higher of the two key commoner subgroups allowed you to build an enclosed farmstead or ring fort. So we can move on to the next picture. I'll just explain to you as an aside what a ring fort is. This is a rath or an earthen ring fort. This is the artist's impression of what one would have looked like, and so if you were able to command the labor to build that, then you were, even though you were only a commoner, and the nobles lived in very similar sort of structures, so there was very little to tell the difference between a noble and a commoner, a wealthy commoner's rath, and so that was one type of enclosed farmstead. We can have a look at the next picture, which shows. Next picture, please. Yeah. This shows a cashel. Now, a cashel is it basically means a enclosed farmstead or built from stone. So they're slightly more expensive, perhaps, but they're generally mainly found in the rocky parts of Ireland as well, and that was another variation of the same sort of idea. But as you can see, there were very similar sort of structures. And the final type is the crannog, which we can have a look at in the next picture. Next picture, yeah, that's it. Okay, so that is a crannog, and a crannog was built on water. Now, the defensive properties of these structures is debatable, but they don't seem to have been capable of fighting off anything more than a few cattle raiders, basically. So I think none of them were really defensive. This was all about status, about establishing your social status in the Tuath. Okay, so to continue with the description of the social system, so not only were the two key commoner subgroups who were allowed to build these enclosed farmsteads, they were also able to acquire clients of their own, and they were the two groups are known as the Boer, and later there's also another group called the Oker, and the Boer basically means cattle chief or cattle lord or whatever you want to call it, a cattle owner. you know, because wealth, in terms of wealth and how people rated you on a monetary level, because there was no money, you were rated on how many cattle you technically owned, even if you'd loaned those cattle out to somebody else. And these subgroups were crucially defined as either free or base, centered on whether you owned the cattle or not. And the minimal criteria for nobles' clients, for example, would have to be at least 5 of each subtype. So you'd have to have 5 free clients and 5 base clients. And usually you should have a lot more. That would be the minimum. Both subgroups were, however, essentially the same legally, though so-called base clients were, of course, less wealthy and also had a more onerous relationship to the patron. So commoners and nobles remained closely linked, as with 30 to 40,000 ring forts built in Ireland were probably raised sometime between the 5th and 10th centuries AD. And there were still 30 to 40,000, that's quite a lot. And they were still, and 30 to 40,000 were still identifiable archaeologically in the 1970s. They're less today, of course, but that gives you an indication of how many there is. And then there's also cashels and cranogs to add to that. So you're talking maybe 50,000 plus of these enclosed farmsteads from the early Christian era. Although only nobles could afford to flaunt their wealth and were, for the most part, the only ones who could afford slaves, commoners, especially those from the higher Bow era or Oak era strata, could realistically aspire to the lifestyle of their betters and to ape it. Furthermore, from the literary records of the period, it appears that joining a noble's war band, because there was a lot of cattle raiding going on, this is basically how another way of you getting your status, and there's a lot of skirmishing, especially during the summer months, as war parties raided each other, or a hunting party. This would have been a profitable way for commoners to acquire the highly prized rewards and gifts for honorable services rendered that the nobles were also craving. So you know, like if you were a commoner and were in your king's war party and the king got attacked and you stepped in to save him, then that could mean a promotion for you. While not stated directly in the sources, by consulting 19th to 20th century African anthropological cognate societies over the bride wealth marriage contract that also applied in Ireland, we can guess that free men of all shades were at least partly relieved of the agricultural duties that of what we understand today as a peasant farmer or campesino or whatever. It is ruled by today, where there's a lot of work, and you only really get time off for holy holidays and things like this. But it seems that the Irish equivalent of a peasant farmer, basically a commoner farmer, had a lot more free time. And how did they manage this? Well, it was probably through the kinswoman's labor, because the bride wealth. The interesting thing about bride wealth is bride wealth is a means of compensating the kin of whoever loses the woman for the loss of her labor. And we know that in Ireland, bride wealth was extremely important part of society. So this, along with their other rights, would have allowed the commoners to considerably more free time and access to decision making than, say, late Roman coloni or early Frankish serfs. Right, we can have a look at basically how people looked in the next picture now. I'll just talk a bit about this briefly. Yeah. So so Irish dress across the medieval period consisted of the brat, which is the, or bra, which is the plaid or the cloak, which you can see in the picture on the left there, and the lania, which was worn underneath the bra, and it was a long sleeved tunic. And the tunic was very long. It could be raised or lowered by a cord around the waist, according to the situation. And everybody had pretty much the same garments. So men wore theirs high and women wore theirs low. Sometimes men wore them low as well, especially if they were clerics or poets or whatever. But by and large, men wore them high, and I suppose women would have, if they were crossing boggy ground, they would have worn them high as well. High status was indicated by the number and the brightness of the colors in the items of clothing. So if you see this modern day picture of the man who's on the left there, you can see that he has a relatively brightly colored cloak, which he and if he was a king or something, it'd be really bright and shiny. It'd be like a Scots tartan or whatever. And they were also by the gold or silver jewelry which they had. This also indicated your status, in particular brooches. Now hair was worn very long for by men. It was usually over their shoulders, and unless they were of very low status, and for women, down to your waist at least, and that's with the exception of slaves. Slaves were often cropped, especially male slaves were cropped. Female slaves, we don't know exactly, but they would probably have had shortish hair as well. The elegant, then they would have worn elegant coiffures or braidings or tiaras in their hair as well. And hair dyes would also be used. So the hair dye is we think, because if you look at a book of one of the famous Irish books of the period is Book of Kells. They show a lot of what appear to be high status men with yellow hair. Now, did this mean that everybody from the high status groups had yellow hair, or does it mean that they dyed it? Well, if you look at the images closely, you'll see that for a lot of them, the hair goes black at the roots. Now that could indicate, of course, that you're if you were of high status but you didn't have fair hair, then you just dyed it to make it look as though you had fair hair. So that's an interesting aside there on appearance. Oh, by the way, that the the picture on the left is slightly wrong. He's in it's slightly long. His hair should be a lot longer, but his footwear are sandals. Sandals would not have been worn. Irish people generally went around without, for the most part, without shoes. But if they did wear shoes, that's where we get the word brogue from. They would have worn leather shoes with holes in them. And you think, well, why wear shoes with holes in them? Well, the simple reason was Ireland was as damp back then as it is today. And if you were often crossing puddles and streams and wading through bogs, and yes, the holes would certainly let the water in, but they would also let it out very, very quickly. So you and with the steam coming off your feet, then you once you're on dry land, then your feet would dry out very quickly too. So at the bottom of the social hierarchy, we should talk a little bit about the unfree. The truly unfree appear. They are mostly slaves or other groups akin to either the metics of ancient Greece or the serfs of feudal Europe. They were allotted low status roles by their masters, tasks typically being hard agricultural labor or servile domestic duties. Slaves were initially acquired as prisoners of war, but could be bought or sold as chattels. So it's a sort of chattel slavery. While the rest of the unfree might be conquered groups who chose to remain on the land after they've been conquered, but under the new masters, wandering travelers of low status without any land or kin, if you like, a sort of pre-runner to today's traveling people, or former commoners who had been reduced to debt by peonage. The unfree had greatly reduced rights and and access to property, and were generally unable to bear arms. That is, unless they were a slave and their master had given them a weapon to carry. But it seems that the society was very fluid and the legal codes flexible enough to allow many of the unfree in time through service to gain to regain commoner status if they were, for instance, a commoner who'd fallen into debt, or if to gain manumission if you were a slave, or to otherwise acquire passage into the more privileged social strata. Although Irish society was in essence patriarchal, patrilineal, and patriarchal, in the legal codes, free women were accorded much higher liberties than had been the case, for instance, in the territories of the former Roman Empire. And this tradition continued with little challenge into the early Christian period. Women had the same rights as men, for example, over owning property. And if they divorced, which was both a common and an easy task for women to do at the time, then they took their full share of the bride wealth back as their own. In addition, there were numerous legally recognized types of marriage, like plenty of them, and they ranged from minimal, so you could have a minimal marriage to a full marriage. And a minimal marriage was basically just shacked up with somebody for even a couple of nights or something. It could be as short as that. With some of these marriages amounted to token rights legitimizing a temporary or trial cohabitation. The jurist class also settled cases of theft, willful damage, insult, rape, and assault. Everybody in the country had a blood price or value. And this was expressed once again in cattle. So you were valued, you would say, well, so-and-so, he's worth 6 cattle, so-and-so's worth 3 cattle, whatever. This is how they or the king might be 20, 30 cattle, whatever. This is according to your status. It was a way of resolving the judicial process. The emphasis was always on achieving a settlement with full recompense for the victim or the wronged person. But punishment in the form of draconian punishment in the form of imprisonment, exile, injury, or death of the perpetrator was avoided in nearly all cases. Now, this was less so in Christian law, which also applied within the Christian settlements within the monasteries, as I'll be talking about in a minute. But in the codes which were handed down by the lawyers, who were now a distinct group, and which applied in most civil law, then punishment was seen as a last resort and something you didn't really want to use at all. You could freely choose the lawyer to represent you in court as well. So you had a range of lawyers who were in the neighborhood at the time, and you went around and you spoke to one of them, you spoke to the next one, and so on and so forth. And you decided what one of those you thought was best to represent you in court. While the law appears to favor, because of this blood price mechanism, it seems to favor those with a higher status in that they would receive a higher payback, obviously, based on their blood price if they won the case. What the other side to it is, if they lost the case, then the law remedied this so that instead they had to pay their own blood price to the winner, not the opponent's blood price. So it's like if you were a king, say, I don't know, this is completely hypothetical, but say you were worth 50 cattle, and you had a barney with a very low ranking peasant who was only worth about 5 cattle, then if you lost the case, you would have to pay him 100 cattle. So there you go. That sort of shows you how the legal system worked. A correct judgment would therefore allow reasonable time for the perpetrator to pay off their dues and to limit hardship wherever possible. Nobody, even a member of the unfree, could be deprived of their means of subsistence or thrown off their land. That's quite important as well. So there was the law made allowance for basic human ability to survive. The the wider kin group was also responsible for paying the wrongdoer's fees if the wrongdoer couldn't or wouldn't do so. So this not only limited the chances of the wrongdoer absconding, but also spread the damage of their actions and helped to curtail the wider kin group's potential tolerance for criminal behavior. Just as an example, I'll throw in a quick example of what was considered to be a correct judgment. Now, this is from the semi-mythological account of the life of Cormac MacArt, who was one of the earliest Irish kings from prehistory, and he had some association with the Aegila, so he was very well versed in legal knowledge, but he was of quite low status himself before he became king. Now, the previous king, the previous king's wife had entered into dispute with a local goat herd. And the dispute was over, she was growing, the king's wife was growing some flaxen material or linen making material for to make very high quality, to make herself a really nice dress or whatever. And the goat and the woman who's a goat herd, she let her goats eat the crops. Whether she did it deliberately or whether she did it by accident, we don't know. But the judgment made at the time by the a legalist, but by the lawyer, was that the woman, that the goat herd should pay back with her goat herd. So her goat herd should be deprived of her goat herd. And this little boy Cormac, who was in the crowd, who would be the next king, in fact, he stepped up and he said, well, hold on a minute, we're going to suspend this case because it's not correct. And he said, no, what should happen in the legal codes, which I know about, is that this woman should not be deprived of her goats. What she should be, what a true and just judgment would be for the goat herd to surrender the wool from her flock. Well, come to think, it must have been sheep. Sorry, not goats. So she had to surrender the wool from her sheep, and in recompense, but she was not to lose her goats, because that would deprive her of a means to subsist. So, and that was actually taken up apparently at the court case, and then other lawyers stood up and said, yes, that is the right judgment. So that gives you an idea of how the legal system worked. We'll just have a brief comparison with the type of societies in Anglo-Saxon England and Merovingian Francia at the time. Now, Anglo-Saxon England actually was quite similar in many ways to the way Irish society was organized. Early Anglo-Saxon society was very similar. They even had two levels of commoner. They had free commoners and they had base commoners. They had a noble strata. They had the kings didn't have, at least initially, did not have legislative powers. Later, and they could be selected by election. We know that. They also had a thrall class, which is like a sort of unfree class at the bottom. And there was also a blood price equivalent as well. So they had vergeld, or which is again a way of valuing people according to their status, but as a way of and the payback system as well would be the same. So if the noble lost the case, he had to pay his own vergeld to the loser, rather than the other way around. But the main difference, as far as, and Merovingian Francia was, they had already inherited quite a bit from the Romans. There would be a lot less inheritance from the Romans in Anglo-Saxon England. In Merovingian Francia, they had been absorbed into the Roman Empire before it even fell. They were already part of the Roman Empire from the 3rd century onwards, and they had already absorbed quite a lot of Roman law into their own legal codes. Plus, they had inherited a lot of coloni, who were sort of the forerunners of the serfs, from Roman estates, when they took over the rest of what was then Gaul. So Merovingian Francia was quite a bit more Romanized, but there's a lot of similarities with Anglo-Saxon England, at least before the kings in Anglo-Saxon England started to become more powerful under the House of Wessex, much later on, and in which case, under which case it did start to change quite significantly at that point, and the kings had acquired legislative power. Now we'll move on to the next picture, and we'll talk a bit about monasteries. Next picture, please. Yeah. So this is an artist's impression of, based on historical fact, of what an early Irish monastery would have looked like. So once again, you can see that they have used they have, it's a settlement with status, so it's enclosed by an earthen bank, in the same way as a rath might be, and the huts inside are not only where the monks live, some of them are where they would be writing in, or meditating, or they might be you can see the distinctive early Irish style church there, just beyond the cross in the middle. Now, we'll talk a little bit about the cross just briefly. The Irish also used the Tau cross, which comes from North Africa, and this is quite interesting. And we actually think that because of their monasticism, that they had a direct contact of some kind with North Africa in this period, because This is where their emphasis on a very strict form and hermetical or hermit-like form of Christianity originated. And so the monasteries were and lots of people flocked to monasteries. Now because the monasteries, Christianity was a new religion in Ireland, and it became very popular and was popular in all social classes. And it was considered to be a good thing for a king, for instance, to award a section of his land to a monastery, because that would bring him prestige, it would bring him status. But the people who lived in the community would, at least in theory, would not be subjected to the same cattle raiding and endemic fighting that was going on outside that, though that will change as we approach the Viking era. Well, before we even get into the Viking era, the monasteries were already raiding each other, right, left, and center as well. But anyway, they were sort of like the biggest of these communities. For instance, Clonard Monastery in County Meath had, we think, around about 3,000 students. Now, when you include all the hangers-on and the women involved, because there were lots of women in these institutions, and a lot of the monks were not even. There was like the core group of monks or nuns, and there was also lay monks and lay nuns, and there was lots of them, and they could intermarry with each other. Obviously, the core monks and nuns couldn't, but the lay monks and lay nuns could intermarry and carry on much the same as everybody else. But they were sort of like the start of what might have developed into towns. Had this development been able to continue. All right, can we have the next picture, please? Next picture, please. Yep, that's good. Okay, so we've got, I mean, this gives you an idea, and there was quite a bit of industry going on. This is one of Ireland's first water mills. Now, the development of water mills starts in the early Christian period and continues, and they were all often connected, or always, in fact, in the early period, connected to monasteries. And this one, you can see a monastery in the background, and it's a labor of the monks which has produced the water mill. And of course, water mills are associated with intensification of productive forces, as was the case in medieval Europe as well. Okay, we can have the next picture. Yeah, so this gives you an idea of the most important monasteries in Ireland and where they were. You have Durrow, you've got Kells in the center of Ireland, and then you have, you can see where Skellig Michael is down in the southwest. And you can see Bangor. Bangor was going to be very important. Bangor was up in the northeast of the country. And then there was Arranmore, Inishbofin. There were quite a lot of settlements on islands, like hermitage type settlements by the monks. And then there are other ones as well in Munster as well. You'll be a big one at Cashel, where also the king of Munster at the time, the Oanachter Cashel, were located. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the sort of spread of the monasteries. Monasteries are very popular in the early development of Christianity in Ireland. They were extremely important. They existed alongside an episcopal system, but the episcopal system was very much in the background in comparison with that of the abbeys and nunneries. So we can move on to the next picture, I think. Yeah. So this on the left there, you can see a page out of the Book of Kells. You've probably everybody's heard of the Book of Kells. The Book of Kells is a manuscript. It's the New Testament, I think, in its entirety, and written in Latin, but inscribed using the distinctive Celtic knotwork and formation of letters, and as you can see, it's a really beautiful manuscript, and you can still go and see it in Trinity College in Dublin. They turn over a page of it every day. That's as much as they can manage without damaging what remains of the book. There are other books which were made in a similar style. The Book of Durrow, for instance, but some of them were lost over time, and some were probably destroyed, and some just have fallen apart. But as you can see, I mean, that is actually made with the ink is gold and silver. There was and the intricacy of those knotwork spirals and all the rest of it is quite extraordinary. On the right of it is the Ardar Chalice. Now that's from the Ardar hoard, which was discovered, and the Ardar Chalice again gives you an idea of the fantastic attention to detail and beauty which is expressed in these in the craftsmanship of the period. Okay, we can move on to the next picture. Yeah. So we're just going to talk a little bit now about saints and scholars, in the sense that that we have these we have a lot of saints' lives are recorded in Irish history. There are supposed to be 12 Irish apostles, meaning that they were basically people who were important in in Ireland, and of course there has to be 12 of them, and they include everybody from Patrick to St. Brendan. And I'll just give you an idea of some of them, and then we will talk about the voyages, particularly of Columba, or Columcille, as he's known in Ireland, across to what's now Scotland, but was then Pictland, and also the voyage, a more important voyage perhaps, of Saint Columbanis, who went across to Gaul or France, and converted the Franks, the Burgundians, and then went on to the Lombardy in Italy, where he died. Okay, so Saint Bridget of Kildare is alleged to have lived between 451 and 525. She's the most famous of female Irish saints. She's a nun credited with founding many abbeys, including a famous one at Kildare. However, there's some debate over whether she was a real person or is a fictional Christianization of an earlier Irish goddess of learning, as she bears uncanny resemblance to the latter in both her name and in the powers which she was alleged to have. Her miraculous powers were almost exactly the same. Saint Brendan the Navigator, he was born in Tralee, County Kerry. He became a monk in the early 6th century. He's said to have traveled to Iona, where he met Columcille, who we'll speak about in a minute. After founding 2 ecclesiastic sites, he is most famous for his epic journey by boat to the island of the Blessed, with 12, of course, it has to be 12, but in some records, it's 14 companions. Although the tale was an imram, this was a, we know that there were a series of Irish stories, or there was a form of Irish storytelling known as the Imra, and this was the was a sort of voyage to the other world, and they were originally pagan stories, but they were Christianized, and St. Brendan is the most famous of these, and we don't know whether these were actually based on real voyages or not, because the stories are fantastical. You know, there's a whole lot of fantastical things happening in them, with demons and sea monsters and islands that appear out of the sea and all sorts of things. But it's speculated that if he did, if there is any truth to the tales, he may have traveled as far as the Azores or even the Americas. And in fact, they have done with a boat, which was constructed in the form of an Irish curragh, which is a boat, very lightweight boat, made of hides and wickerwork, and a sail, was a famous nautical experimenter, archaeological experimenter, made a voyage. He conducted what he called St. Brendan's voyage across, and he successfully reached the coast of America in this and back again, I think, in this craft. So it is possible. Another famous saint was Saint Phinead of Clonard, and he lived from roughly 470 to 549 AD, and he founded a monastery at a hole in Wicklow, and also he also founded the Skellig Michael Hermitage in Kerry before establishing the greatest of early Irish monasteries at Clonard, County Meath, with up to 3,000 students, who included Columcille of Iona and Ciaran of Clonmacnoise. Now, Saint Ciaran of Clonmacnoise, there are two Saint Ciarans. He's considered Saint Ciaran the Younger, lived from 516 to 549, and he was of humble origins, his father being a carpenter. He studied under Phinead of Clonard alongside Columcille, and also under Saint Enda of Arran. As well as being the founder of the greatest of early Irish monasteries at Clonmacnoise, he ensured that succession to that abbey, would be non-hereditary. And this became a problem that plagued many abbeys later on that were founded by aristocratic monks and got tied into local politics far more than they should have done. And this led to, as I've been explaining earlier, to them being involved in local warfare. So, you know, the monks would be going out and fighting monks from another monastery, which is perhaps a bit contradictory as far as Christian values and so on were concerned. Now Saint Columcille, or Saint Columba as he's often known, he lived between about 521 and 597. He was from the northern Ineal. Remember, we talked about the northern and southern Ineal. And he studied under Phinead of Movilla, who was another Saint Phinead. Exiled for his responsibility in a killing that took place in a holy sanctuary under his care, he was banished to Iona, which was Iona is very close to the Argyll Peninsula, which is the bit of Scotland that reaches down and nearly touches Ireland. And he was banished there simply because, well, Dalriata, which is the kingdom, which was in the North Antrim, it also expanded. It was already established on the Argyll Peninsula as well. And in time, the Dalriata would in fact become Scotland's first dynasty, ruling dynasty. At this time, they were still outnumbered by Pictish kingdoms. There were several Pictish kingdoms that we know about, and they ruled most of Scotland at the time. Columba had two famous pupils. One was Saint Aidan, who also became a missionary, but this time he proselytized to the Angles of Northumbria, and he founded the great abbey on Lindisfarne, which was going to be raided by the Vikings at the end of the 8th century. The other one connected to him is Saint Adonan, or Unan as he's often known, and he was a follower, stroke biographer of Columba, and lived between 624 and 704. He was also related to Columcille. He is most associated with a monastery on Iona, where he spent most of his life. He was in close contact, however, with the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, which you've already talked about with Saint Aidan, which he visited frequently. He compiled the Vita Columba, which is the life of Columba. It's pretty much a hagiography, but it gives us important information about the Picts and on the life of an Irish monk, and also helped establish. He also there's Adonan, interestingly, he helped establish early rules of war. This is like a very early form of the Geneva Codes of the Geneva Conventions to protect civilians during wartime, and that was he conducted that at the Synod of Birr in Scotland, which was attended by Irish, by Pictish, and by Northern English clergy who also took part in this and established this code of behavior around civilians in wartime. So that's quite important information there. Now we're going to now deal with Saint Columbanus. Right now, Saint Columbanus he lived roughly from 540 to 615. Now, if you look at the top of the blue arrows, ignore the red arrows, but the blue arrows are quite important. So the topmost of those, that shows Columcilla's mission to the Picts of Scotland, and it also shows the journey of his successors who went to Lindisfarne, and then they also went down as far as East Anglia, proselytizing Christianity, or the Irish form of Christianity, because once they ran into the Roman people under the Roman tradition, there was often conflict, and that was over practices such as recognizing the correct day for Easter and so on and so forth, but also to do with the monastic versus the episcopal forms of Christianity, and I think that was all resolved at the Synod of Whitby eventually, but that's beyond our period. And then if you can see the other journey there, it goes to Gaul. It goes all the way down, and then this is Columbanus, and as you can see, he made two trips, and then he had to go back and he had to start all over again, pretty much. But his first he studied at Clonard on Loch Earn first of all, and then he went after completing his training at Bangor Abbey under Saint Comgall. He received permission to evangelize in Europe, and he landed in Saint Malo in Brittany, and from there he was welcomed by the Burgundian king of King Gontram, and he founded several monasteries in the kingdom. He then fell foul of the Gaelic bishops, who opposed his haircut. They didn't like his hairstyle because he was wearing a tonsure, but it was the Celtic tonsure. We don't know quite what the Celtic tonsure was, but it was supposed to be a tonsure from ear to ear, and whatever that means. But it was seen as being barbarian and uncouth by the Romans. And so he founded several monasteries in the Burgundian kingdom. He then fell foul of the Gaelic bishops, and they tried to put him on trial, but he refused to attend the trial. He was quite a outspoken, and he was a bit of a controversial character, shall we say. He made an appeal to Pope Gregory I, but the appeal was never answered. And after further wanderings, he went back to, as you can see here, the second journey. The second journey went further north, and it was a much longer one. And he was welcomed by Clonard II, who was the most powerful Frankish king of the period. The Franks were divided into three kingdoms, and so he established more monasteries there, and then he went across the Alps and ended his mission with the conversion of the king of the Langobards or Lombards in northern Italy, and he died at a place called Bobbio in northern Italy, and his grave and his tomb can still be found there. Okay, so we're going to finish up pretty shortly. We're just going to move on to the last picture. Now this we're actually going slightly out of the beyond. Yeah, this is John Scotus Eriugena. Now it's quite an odd name he has. He's not Duns Scotus. You mustn't get him confused with Duns Scotus, but John Duns Scotus. But he was he was an Irish theologian, Neoplatonist, philosopher, and poet, who for a time he headed the palace school at Aachen. Now, this is in the Carolingian period. This is slightly beyond the scope of what we're doing, but I decided to deal with him now because it'll make more sense if I deal with him now rather than come back to him in the next episode. Now, he lived roughly from about 800 to 877, and he was as I say, a Neoplatonist philosopher. That's mainly what he's remembered for, and he hold on a minute. I just got to get this plugged in before I run out of power. Right? Okay. And he headed the Carolingian palace school at Aachen for a period, being fluent in Greek, which is quite unusual in Western Europe at the time. He translated Pseudo Dionysius, who was a late Roman period Neoplatonist philosopher. And he also wrote his own book, which is called The Division of Nature. His discourses, where they helped lay the foundations. Now, this is quite important. Helped lay the foundations for Western logical and dialectical thought, and this was to lead on. He had a big influence on Bruno and Malebranche, who were theological philosophers who continued his work, but also Spinoza, who's more an Enlightenment figure, Kant, Hegel, and also Marx, because of the development of logical and dialectical thought. So this is actually a picture we have no idea what he looked like. It's the same with all the Irish clerics. Any pictures you see are probably nothing like what they look like. But this is an artist's rendition of what he might have looked like, and was originally in the old Irish currency used to get the five punt note, and he was his face, John Scotus's imagined image was on that note. Okay, so I think it's time to for me to wrap up and for you guys to bombard me with questions.